Hey folks, and welcome back to another Unity Playground tutorial. This time we're going to be looking at bringing in some assets from outside of Unity, and I've just gone ahead and opened up my current playground file. If you've opened yours up and you already have some things in the file, you can go up to File and say New Scene, and once you've done that, you can just double click on Basic 2D, and that's just going to give you a completely fresh scene starting from scratch so that we don't have any of our old stuff cluttering us up. Now, if you want to follow along, this is a Unity tutorial. There is a link that is on the Moodle if you're one of my students, and there's a link on the description of this video if you're just joining us on YouTube. So I'm going to go through these steps. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on some things I think are more important. I might gloss over some other things, but the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this hamburger that they're giving us on this tutorial so that I can use it to talk about some things. So let me make some room in the background here, and I'm just going to click on that hamburger and I'm going to drag it onto my desktop, and I'm going to give it a name that makes sense. There we go. It's a hamburger.png. And I know that a little bit later, we're going to also grab this image. So I'm just going to open that up and drag this onto my desktop at the same time. And I'm going to call this sprite sheet. And then I'm going to pull that window out of the way, and I'm going to drag the hamburger into my assets folder, and I'm also going to grab and drag my sprite sheet, or their sprite sheet, here into the images folder of my playground file. Now, if you've been watching some of my older tutorials, the main difference between last year's tutorials and this year's tutorials is that with the updates to Playground, everything is now in a folder called Unity Technologies, and then it's in a folder called Playground, and that's where you're going to find your images folder. So what I'm going to do here is I like to keep this a little bit organized. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to say Create Folder. And because this is just a few exercises and we're not doing a whole build, I'm not going to organize these files into folders that make sense by type, but I'm just going to give it a name. Profmoto stuff, so that I know if I'm trying to find things, I know where to look. Drop those in that folder, and then I'm just going to work in that folder for right now. Okay, so I've got the hamburger, you've got the hamburger, and it's in our assets, and we're just going to drag it onto the scene. And if I zoom in on that a little bit, we can now see that pretty well. If I select the hamburger down here, not the hamburger up here, if I select it down here in my assets, I can make changes to it like it's a prefab because it's a sprite that's being imported, and if I make the changes to essentially the file down here, it will affect all of the instances that I've placed in the world. So let's take a look at some of these. It is a texture type sprite. That's totally what makes sense for what we're doing. It is in sprite mode single, which is exactly what we need this hamburger to be. We'll talk a little bit more about multiple in just a second. The next thing is pixels per inch. And this is one thing, if you're trying to make a sort of 8-bit style game or, a slightly pixel based game, we're going to probably want to crank this number down. And I'm going to say 16. And I'm going to go ahead and down here, I'm going to say apply. And that is going to scale up my hamburger. So it's going to be a little bit larger on my screen. Now, I've scaled that up, and it's looking like it's a little too big right now, given the size of my camera. So I can also select my main camera. And, I like to have a frame size of about 12. And we'll zoom out to that frame size. All right, so that's about typical for me when I'm doing these tutorials. Okay. Jumping back to this hamburger and making sure we're working on the one in our assets folder, not the one that's in our game already, we're going to make a few more changes. So this image, there's a little bit of blurring that happens. There's a little bit of sort of filtering that's happening to this image. It's a super pixel based image. And if we zoom in, those pixels aren't very sharp. So there is a filter that is applied by default. It's a bilinear filter. And if we change that to point, it will mean there's no filter, and we just say apply. And then we see that nice and sharp happening now. Now, another thing that we want to do, and this is not something I think that's mentioned in the tutorial, but if we're working with these types of palettes, it doesn't jive nicely with this default setting here of format automatic. You're going to be much more benefited by saying RGBA for red, green, blue, alpha, 32-bit. And that's going to limit the sort of what I think of when I think of JPEG compressions happening to your images. And I'll show you a little bit later how that actually happens, but it's a good habit to get in the habit of setting this RGBA 32-bit. Okay, now once we have those set up, we should be all set. If I scroll out here, that is my hamburger. If I select it, I can move it wherever I want to. I can add multiple ones. I can hit Control D or Command D on a Mac to make duplicates. And when I press play, they're all going to look like lovely hamburgers on my screen. Fantastic. So that's how we bring in an outside image into Unity. I've just, again, gone ahead and placed these on my desktop, and I'm just dragging them into a folder that makes sense. In this case, it's Assets, Unity, Technologies, Playground, Images. I'm putting everything into my Playground folders. If I was working on my own game, I might have my own folders that are just under Assets, and I might keep everything that's in Playground a little bit separately. But this is making sense for my organization for our tutorials. So the next thing we're going to do is with this sprite sheet. And this sprite sheet has, you can sort of see in the preview down here, there's a whole bunch of different icons that are in this sheet. And if I just drag this onto the screen, you can see that. And if I go and make some of the changes we made with the hamburger, this image is going to get really large. Like if I set pixels to pixels per unit to 16, if I go down and turn bilinear to point, no filter, and if I change format to RGBA 32-bit and hit apply, this thing is now gigantic. And if I select it and move it out of the way. So why would we do this? Well, when games were first being made, we had to be really smart about how we were using memory. So rather than loading a whole bunch of different images into memory, it made sense to load one image, which then was a smaller footprint, load it in memory once, and then use different pieces of it to essentially cut it up and use those different pieces for the different artifacts in game. This is still a really smart process. It's using less memory, and it's still something that a lot of games are doing. So it's one of the things that we can really easily do here, and there's some other really nice benefits that we're going to get into in the next couple tutorials. So let's make some changes to this sprite sheet and make it work for us. I'm actually going to delete the sprite sheet from my scene. I'm just selecting it in the hierarchy and hitting delete. And I'm going to select it here in my assets again, and I'm going to change sprite mode from single to multiple. Now, when I'm doing multiple, I have to tell it how I want it to understand one image as multiple. So to do that, I need to go to the sprite editor. And I have forgotten to apply the settings. I needed to click apply down here. I should have done that, but it's letting me just click apply right there. Okay, so we're now in the sprite editor, and I can go up here to slice and open up slice. So automatic is the way that it's currently set, and I need to tell it, I need to give it instructions on how to cut this up. So I'm asking it to do grid by cell count. Now, while we're doing this, I want to say that this is a imperfect image, this one that we downloaded from Unity's website. It's got some big problems, and I'm using it so I can highlight these problems, and then I'm going to show you where we can get an image that works a little bit better. So to get to that stage, we can start with columns and rows. So if we can just count how many columns there are and count how many rows there are, then we can type that in. So I've already counted, and there's 14 columns, and there's 7 rows. And if I say slice, it's going to slice it, and that's where all of those red lines are happening. Now, I can say apply, and now they've all turned to white lines to show that it actually has been sliced. If I zoom in on this, you can see that edge is a little messy. The left-hand side of this image is a little messy, and that's really the problem. If I zoom in over here, you can see that there's some issues happening here too. But we're going to talk about that in a minute. We're not going to worry about it right now. I'm going to go ahead and close that. And now when I drag this sprite sheet in to my scene, it understands that it's multiple, and it's going to prompt me to turn this into an animation. Now, this isn't something you would normally do with one of these sprite sheets, but for the sake of seeing this, I'm going to go ahead and call this the sprite sheet. Hit save. And now if I press play, it's just going to scroll through all of those different images that we had set up within this sheet. Now you can see some of those issues happening over there on the left-hand side. So I'm going to show you some ways that we can correct this. So if I go back to my sprite sheet and I go back to my sprite editor, well, if we go under grid by cell count again, and we were saying it was 14 by 7, we could try and do some things where we're adding an offset, or it would be pushing it over, but that really cascades across the sheet, and I think it creates problems. We could try and do some things where we were doing some padding, maybe in both directions and sort of cutting into the image, and that might get us to a good spot. But what I've found with this file is the best thing that works is instead going to grid by cell count, and instead of 64, I think this image is 100 by 100, and that is looking kind of close, except my padding is off. So 100 by 100, it looks kind of good, but if I make a few more subtle changes here, let's see, I believe that I say 98, 98, and then I like to set the offset of 2 in the X, and then set the padding to 2 and 2. And I miss a little bit here, but for this image, it's pretty much the best I'm going to get. There we go. And I'm going to say slice, and I'm going to say apply, and then I'm going to close this, and then I'm going to try playing this. So that's a little bit better. It's a little less messy, but you can see on a couple images, the left-hand side is, it's got some problems. So I'm going to stop that. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you about this fantastic website called kenny.nl. There's a whole bunch of different things that I'm going to be highlighting in my tutorials about the assets on this. The creature mixer we will get into, and we'll talk about that. But the simplified performer pack is one of the things. Look at that. It looks just like what we're working with right now. It's got a few added bonuses, and I can go ahead and say download. I've already gone ahead and downloaded that, and I'm just going to drag it over here onto the desktop where you can see it. And I'm going to double click it. And inside that, there's a whole bunch of different things, but what we're going to be looking for is the tile sheet. The performer pack character is this, cheerful little Nintendo person over here. We're not going to use that. We're going to use this tilesheet.png and tilesheet at 2, which looks like it is maybe a higher fidelity version. So I'm just going to grab both of those. I'm going to extract them from the zip, put them on my desktop. And once I have them on the desktop, let's see, where did they go? once I have them, here they are, they're located right here, and I'm just going to drag that first one right in here. And that is the platform pack tile sheet. Now, we need to do all the same settings. We're going to change this to a multiple. We are going to change bilinear to point, and we are going to change format to RGBA 32 bits. There we go. And once we have those all done, we're going to say apply. And we're going to go to the sprite editor. So the first thing you'll notice is that the background is no longer black. The background is now an alpha channel transparency, which is pretty nice. So we don't have that big black thing underneath. Before, if we had changed our background to black, it might have worked out better. But here we just have nice alpha channel working. The other thing is you can see that left-hand side is nice and clean. So if we go to our slice and say grid by cell count and say 14 by 7 and slice and apply, there we go, nice and perfect. Now the other thing that we can do here is, if we're working on things, having something named platform pack underscore tile sheet 0 or platform pack underscore tile sheet 1 might not be that great. So what we might want to start doing is giving these things names like grass, dirt, and I don't really know what that beigey color is, so I've been in the habit of calling this yogurt dirt. And this one is snow dirt. Or, this one's over here is grass, dirt, float. This one is grass, rock. And we can go all through that and make these kind of corrections as we want. The other thing that we can do is, if you're someone who wants to work in tiles, which we're going to be working on later, like this is perfect, having each one of these be separate. But some of you are going to work in a slightly different way, and you're going to want to have these tiles actually be one piece rather than two pieces. And so in that case, you can actually delete one of these tiles, and then you can stretch or increase the size of one of these so that it fits the entire thing. So that would mean that rather than having a 64 by 64 here, this might be a 64 by 128. And so that's entirely possible depending on how you're working. I'm going to just revert back. I can't revert back enough, so I'm going to try and re-trim and re-slice. There we go. And the nice thing that's updated since last year's tutorial is you can now elect to have the empty rectangles deleted by default, and then if you want to keep them, you can click the box. In last year's tutorial, I was actually showing people how you could delete all of these empty spaces so that it wouldn't be taking up memory. And actually, that's not a bad thing here, because look, these appear to be empty, but the computer has gone ahead and sliced them. So if we want to, we can just delete those so they won't be taking up memory in your game. And when we're all set, we're going to go ahead and say apply. Let's go ahead and close that. And then let's try dragging this platform piece in. It will also give us the prompt for an animation. We'll call it the platform pack and say save. And that one's coming in really small. So the one that is coming from Kenny is super small by comparison. Oh, no, it's not. It's because I forgot to change this to 16. Oh, there we go. Still a little bit smaller. Let's put those two together and let's see what they look like. Actually, you know what? I want that to be closer to the same size. Oh, of course it went the wrong way. I want to change that to 8, as in 8-bit. There we go. Okay. Now if I play these two animations, you'll see how this one's super clean on this edge. This one still has a few, and it's mainly just that There's a little blip over there on the left. Okay, so now that we have that, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to delete both of these because you're not going to typically be creating an animation out of all of these different things. You're going to be using specific tiles in what you're doing. And so if you click this arrow next to your sprite sheet, you can grab one of these specific things and you can go ahead and put them into your scene. And, oh, it looks like I resliced it after I did the naming. So the naming is coming up as the generic name. So really to make this work, I should go back to my sprite editor and I should, change this back to, this was grass dirt. This one was grass rock. And let's just go ahead and apply that, close this. And sure enough, that one's now grass dirt and this one's grass rock. And we should actually, let's do a quick test. I don't know if these will update once they're placed into the scene. So I'm curious if they will. Let's do that again. So this one we were calling yogurt dirt. So let's apply that and close this. And that is now showing up at the end as yogurt dirt, and it did not get corrected in here. So if we want to make it show with the correct name, we're going to need to do that. And so a couple things there. One, we know that the ones that are placed in the scene won't update in terms of name. But also down here, we see that if we make a change to the sprite sheet after we've sliced it like this, those changes go to the bottom and get us sort of out of the pattern or the order that we have up here. Okay, so to recap, we have this wonderful ability to bring in outside images as assets, as sprites. We have a sprite sheet that was given to us by Unity that has some issues on the left-hand side, but we now know that we can go to Kenney, KENNEY.NL to get a simplified platformer pack that contains all of the same pieces that are nice and clean. And we now know how we can cut these up, and then we can use the individual pieces to put them into the stage, into the scene, and build our game. We also, if we're going to Kenney.NL, we also have the ability to create little creatures, little avatars, and make them work in the game. And that's going to be exactly what we do in our next tutorial. So I hope you join us for that as well. Thanks a lot for listening, and let me know if you've got any questions or comments.